Good afternoon, Your Majesty. Thank you again from the bottom of our hearts for your presence at the symposium. It is now a true privilege to present to you the keynote address by Professor Richard Kagan, a member of the board of the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute and the head of the Institute's program committee. Professor Kagan will take your questions at the end of his presentation. Richard Lauren Kagan, Arthur Lovejoy Professor Emeritus of History at Johns Hopkins University and PhD from University of Cambridge, is an authority on modern history, specifically in the exploration of the intellectual and legal facets of the Spanish Empire during the Habsburg era. The author of numerous works, his most recent book, The Inquisition's Inquisitor, Henry Charles Lee of Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania Press, 2025, explores the life and scholarship of this pioneering historian of the Spanish Inquisition. His earlier book, The Spanish Craze, delves into America's historical fascination with Spanish literature, art, architecture, and culture. Professor Kagan's significant scholarly contributions have made him a resident member of the American Philosophical Society, where he was recently elected to the Governing Council and a corresponding member of the Royal Academy of History of Spain. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kagan.
You want your phone? She forgot something. Your Majesty, friends, colleagues, it's a delight to be here. And it's a privilege to be able to give this address to this gathering. It's an important one. As Thomas Chavez has said, it's momentous that we'll be able to celebrate Spain's contributions to the American Revolutionary War. But the question I want to begin with is that how many of you really know very much about the subject we're dealing with? I mean, last evening and this morning, we've learned a great deal about different facets of Spain's relationship to the United States during the Revolutionary era and the extent to which its contributions, whether monetary or military, material, helped the 13 colonies achieve victory in their struggle for independence from Great Britain's and King George III. Now, and there's more to come this afternoon. But the question I like to ask is, why should this topic strike us as so new? Why didn't we learn about these things before? I was never taught at school about Spain's role in the revolution. How many of you? Raise your hands. Not too many. Not too many. How do we explain this absence, this gap, this lacuna in our collective historical memory? And I'm not so sure that I have all the answers to that particular question. But I'll give it a try by offering a brief survey of the historiography, the American historiography, the US historiography surrounding the War of Independence, and the reasons why historians, particularly those here in the United States, have chose to erase, to ignore, or at the very least, diminish the importance of Spain's contribution to the birth of American democracy. Now, a few facts. Let's see if I can get this rolling. On February 18th, 1780, George Washington, then encamped at a place called Morristown, New Jersey, received a letter from Juan de Muralles, Spain's unofficial representative to the Continental Congress. That letter provided the general with a report on Bernardo de Galvez' recent victories against British installations, places called Mount Shock, Baton Rouge, and other places along the Mississippi River in Louisiana. And a week later, Washington replies, thanking Muralles for news of these victories And noting they, and I quote Washington, they advanced the immediate interest of His Majesty, that is Charles III of Spain, and they promote the common cause, end of quote. Washington then added, they will probably have a beneficial influence, the they being the victories, they will probably have a beneficial influence on the efforts of the southern states at this present juncture, end of quote. Now news of these victories spread rather quickly. And I'm sorry for the little fuzziness in these old newspapers. For instance, the Pennsylvania Packet, the leading Philadelphia newspaper that at the time brought those victories to the attention of the public just 4 days later, on February 22nd, 1780. And other newspapers in different parts of the colonies followed suit. In June of 1780, brought forth more articles announcing Galvez's successful capture of the British outpost at Fort Charlotte on the Bay of Mobile. And many more such articles appeared in the wake of Galvez's victory over the British forces in Pensacola, West Florida, in May 1781. And especially curious is the article in the Boston Evening Post. No, excuse me, I got to go backwards. Hello? It doesn't go backwards. Ignore that. Especially curious is the article in the Boston Evening Post recounting the festivities held in all places in Havana on December 5th, 1781, a festivity staged by the captains of various American warships that were docked in that harbor. And they organized festivities in honor of Galvez. They referred to Galvez as a warm friend of our country. And then the captains ordered the gunners to fire a celebratory cannonade, what's known in French as a feu de joie, a joyful fire. Boom, 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 boom. The cannons went off one after another. And an elegant dinner followed with the American captains offering toasts, and I quote, to the most Christian king, that is to say, Louis XVI of France, to his most Catholic majesty, Spain's Charles III, together with others honoring George Washington, Bernardo de Galvez, and General José de Solano, another Spanish officer who had fought at Pensacola. These and other articles suggest that in the course of the war, particularly in 1780, 1781, Galvez, if not exactly a household name, had achieved a modicum of notoriety. Along with it, a place in the historical record of America's struggle for independence. Now, fast forward now, a few years, and the appearance of the first histories of the American Revolution, here we are, by three ardent supporters of the new republic. One was William Gordon, a Congregationalist pastor from Roxbury, Massachusetts, first published in 1788. Another history was by a man named David Ramsey, a South Carolina legislator and congressman, published in 1789. And that of Mercy Otis Warren, a longtime resident of Plymouth, Massachusetts, first published, she'd written a long time, first published or only published in 1805. And note that Mercy was the first woman to write a history of the American Revolution, as I'm sure the members of our host institution, the Daughters of the American Revolution, are aware. Now, apart from newspaper and personal accounts, one of the key sources for each of these historians was the Annual Register, a British journal which published a yearly account called The History of the War in America, and that included references to Spain's successful attack on British garrisons in Nicaragua. It included accounts of the surrender of West Florida to Galvez and the landing of a Spanish force at Minorca in its list of the most remarkable events of 1781. Now, it was just the opposite for Gordon and Ramsey, neither of whom had much to say about Spain's contributions to the war effort, save for a brief sentence noting Galvez's expeditions against British settlements in West Florida, together with the successful reduction of Pensacola. For her part, Warren, and let's get a close-up of Warren. This is not working. Oh, there she is. For her part, Warren managed a bit more, as her book referred to Galvez as an enterprising Spaniard who, having encountered storms, dangers, disappointments, and difficulties almost innumerable, managed to achieve several important victories. On the other hand, Warren belittled the importance of Spanish support for the colonists, berating its monarchy for its initial reluctance to ally with the rebels, while dismissing its financial contribution to the war effort with a single word: trivial. Now, to better understand the rationale behind this kind of dismissal of Spain in these early histories, and the same applies to later accounts of the war, it's worth remembering that, with the exception of Ramsay, all of these historians were Protestant New Englanders steeped in the deeply rooted anti-Catholic prejudices of that era, prejudices that they inherited from long-standing British as well as Dutch attitudes towards Spain, and those attitudes date from the 16th century and the wars of religion. In addition, their understanding, that is to say, the historians' understanding of the war, was profoundly sectional. Essentially, it privileged the campaigns in the East, in the Northeast, as opposed to those in the South, that is to say, along the Gulf Coast. And while the politics of these historians differ, Warren, for example, was a staunch anti-federalist, that is to say, someone who was suspicious of a strong central federal government. Ramsay was not. But they were united in envisioning their histories as a record of bravery and heroic achievement that they hoped might serve to unify what remained a decidedly divided and fractious young nation. The historians also joined forces in conceiving of their new nation as one that was divinely sanctioned to champion republicanism, to champion religious freedom, along with the values and virtues, self-reliance, industriousness, investment in education and science, the values and virtues, in other words, that would ensure that young nation's continuing progress and future success. For Warren, moreover, the colonists' victory was integral to what she had conceived as a divine plan towards freedom through revolutions against tyranny, a word that's often in the press today. The problem for Spain in the 1780s and 90s, the problem for Spain then, is it had no role to play in that master plan. Together with most other Protestant historians, or most other Protestant Americans of their generation, Warren and other historians tend to equate Spain with the Inquisition, an institution that was synonymous with religious bigotry and persecution. They also regarded the country as one dominated by a conservative Catholic clergy, a clergy that they perceived that was hostile to learning and science. And then, too, they inherited the Enlightenment view of Spain. Think of writers like Montesquieu, Voltaire, Diderot, or Robertson from Scotland. The Enlightenment view of Spain as a country that was once a great power in the age of Philip II, or the age of Ferdinand and Isabel, when it was exploring the world and kind of discovering the world. It was once a great power, but a power that was subsequently devoured by a noxious cocktail of despotic monarchy and entrenched feudal nobility, Roman Catholicism, along with the Inquisition. And that same cocktail with those ingredients prevented Warren from recognizing Spain's embrace of Enlightenment values, together with the efforts of its monarchy, Charles III, just then, and his ministers. and his ministers to reform Spain's economy, to promote education, industry, commerce, and trade. We learned about some of those reforms yesterday, but Warren and the other historians just turned their back on it. Rather, she adhered to the established view of Spain as a country dominated by monarchic despotism, a country that was hostile to the promotion of enterprise and industry. It was very easy, therefore, for Warren, together with Gordon and Ramsay and other early historians of the American Revolution, to ignore, or at the very least, diminish Spain's contribution to the revolution. How, they asked, how could a country that represented everything the revolution had struggled to defeat, despotic monarchy, aristocracy, religious persecution, how could such a country have possibly contributed anything of substance to America's victory in that war? Best, therefore, to ignore it, cast it aside. And it turns out that's exactly what happened. Clio, the muse of history, can be quite cruel. She opens her eyes when she wants to. She closes them on other occasions when she wants to. And as we shall see, she closed her eyes for a very long time. And they remain such. But we'll see. Already by the start of the 19th century, those eyes were firmly shut. And already by the start of the 19th century, the historical template regarding this country's interpretation of the American Revolution was firmly in place, and it proved very resistant to change. In other words, the template established by Ramsay, Gordon, and Warren was there, and very few people stood up to challenge it. And on top of this, and despite the dogged efforts of Spain's Ferdinand VII to squelch the movement for independence in its American colonies, efforts that were widely reported in the North American press, those efforts of Ferdinand VII to squelch the movement for independence reinforced the view that the United States and Spain stood at opposite ends of the political spectrum, with the former, the U.S., representing freedom and democracy, with Spain representing or embolizing an emblem of repression and monarchical tyranny. That image of the country, so persistent, helps to explain why historians in this country during the first part of the 19th century, come on, you missed, during the first part of the 19th century found it difficult to say very much about Spain's involvement in the war. To be fair, this guy, Richard Hildreth, a Massachusetts-based historian, at least recognized the importance of Galvez's accomplishments, noting, for example, I quote him, "The Spanish governor of New Orleans was prompt to take steps for establishing a claim to the territory east of the Mississippi. As soon as he had heard of the declaration of war, he invaded West Florida with a force of 1,400 men, Spanish regulars, American volunteers, and people of color," end of quote. In contrast, this guy, George Tucker, a professor at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville down there, having recognized that the threat of an independent United States posed to the integrity of its own overseas empire, he said, whoa, Spain is a bit cautious about it. Spain, he wrote, only allied with France in order to out-Britain the British from Gibraltar, together with Minorca and Jamaica. That's partially true. As for Galvez, however, his name does not even appear in Tucker's history. And the same is true of this guy's history. Perhaps the most important and influential history of the United States ever written during the 19th century, and certainly the one that was most widely read. A staunch nationalist and a firm believer in progress, Bancroft, he was at Harvard, then in government. Bancroft represented Spain as a retrograde country, hostile to the values the revolution enshrined. Specifically noting, and here I quote him, noting that, and I quote, "the wave of free thought that swept across Europe in the 18th century broke as it rolled across the Pyrenees." It's a fabulous image. Boom, the wave of free thought stopping at the Pyrenees. He must have read that famous statement, a tribute to the 19th century France, Africa begins at the Pyrenees. Spain, Bancroft added, had, and I quote, no Calvin, no Voltaire, no Rousseau, no Pascal, nothing congenial to free thought, end of quote. It was rather a country, and I quote again, a country benumbed by superstition and priestcraft, is a great word, and tyranny over mind. Also one that fears freedom, and that example of the North American colonies might spread to its own, end of quote. He also suggested that of, and I quote, that of all the European powers, Spain was the most consistently and most perseveringly hostile to the United States. And for this reason, it only allied with France in order to recover Gibraltar, partly true. It follows that Bancroft's account of the capture of West Florida fails to identify Galvez by name. In modern parlance, Galvez was ghosted, canceled. Spain's contribution to the revolution effectively erased. And a similar lacuna can be found in virtually all later 19th and 20th century histories of the war. The majority written by authors like Bancroft, who hailed from the Northeast and whose take on the war remained decidedly sectionalist. That is to say, they generally, by downplaying the importance of the campaigns in the South, that is in Louisiana and Florida, and it was also nationalist to the extent that they ignored that the war was part of the global struggle that pitted Great Britain against both France and Spain, and one that was fought, as we learned yesterday and this morning, on numerous fronts. Now, as I've mentioned earlier, yesterday evening and this morning, and really in the course of this conference, this whole conference is designed, of course, to present another picture of the war. But here I should emphasize that revisions to what we can call it, let's call it the standard or the received account of the Revolutionary War. That's the one that we were all taught, that I was taught. It was in place, but the people began to nibble away at it, chew away at it, chop away at it. But they did so, it didn't come from historians in the East or the Northeast. It came from scholars located in the South and the West, regions whose view of the history of the United States was notably different from that of the guys like Bancroft or Mercy Warren. In a sense, when you're writing, as Thomas Chavez is often writing from vantage point in New Mexico, the Pilgrims look very far away. You have a very different view of how the America was created, or North America, the United States was created. And I want to begin with Louisiana, where historians were particularly keen to document their state's French past and their Spanish past. Already, in the 1820s, for example, this guy, François Xavier Martin, his history of Louisiana devoted an entire chapter, 1827, entire chapter to Galvez, emphasizing the strategic importance of his victories on the Revolution's southern front. But nobody read, or very few people read, Martin outside of Louisiana. Even more influential, move. We need an upgrade. Charles Gaillard-Garet, a prominent Louisiana politician of Spanish descent. In 1847, he persuaded the Louisiana state government to commission the noted Spanish scholar, Pascual de Gallegos, to visit the Spanish archives in Simancas, Madrid, and Seville, and provide him with transcriptions of documents pertinent to Louisiana's history. And Gallegos' discovery in those archives subsequently enabled Gaillard to write a detailed, well-documented account of Galvez's tenure as governor of Louisiana, both before and after the War of Independence. But while Galvez's findings did little to alter the standard account of the war, once again, he wasn't really read widely, his account of the siege of Pensacola caught the attention of this guy, Thomas Buckingham Smith, a historian of Florida, who in 1860 published a first-hand account of the siege of Pensacola by a British officer by the name of Robert Farmer in a journal called the Historical Magazine. And that same siege also attracted the attention of another Louisiana historian, this guy, Gaspar Cassuch, a railroad magnate of Catalan descent. Having located a printed copy of Bernardo Galvez's detailed diary of his operations against Pensacola in a London bookshop, that diary our wonderful actor impersonator, well, maybe he's the real man, quoted from yesterday, having located a published copy of that in a London bookshop, Cassuch published it in an English translation in 1917. Now, the appearance of this important document, Galvez's diary, in English at this time, was no accident. Rather, it reflected the then current vogue for what was called scientific history, or history based on original documents and archival materials. And also aligned with an orchestrated campaign spearheaded by the Department of Historical Research of the Carnegie Institution here in Washington, D.C. And that campaign was designed to locate, to describe, and wherever possible, to print and publish original documents located in the archives, both domestic and foreign, which could be used to offer a new interpretation, or at least a revised interpretation, of the early history of the United States. It also coincided with a moment when interest in the early history of America's western frontier, that of the Southwest or Spanish borderlands and the Pacific coast, was in vogue. Call it the kind of the scholarly component of what I designated a few years ago as the Spanish craze that swept across the United States in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War, and a moment when everything Spanish, architecture, dress, music, literature, was in vogue. No surprise then that some of the first publications of the Carnegie Program surveyed archives both in Cuba and Spain, looking for documents pertaining to the United States. And under the circumstances, the documents these guides had unearthed provided historians with new information that allowed for revisions in the standard account of the Revolutionary War. Cleo, however, our muse, kept her eyes shut. She proved resistant to change, except in faraway California, home to a cluster of scholars, H.H. Bancroft, no relation to George, Bernard Moses, Herbert Bolton in particular, who were eager to document the history of that state, and along with other parts of the Southwest, and even more broadly, to learn more about the historical relationship between Spanish America and North America. In other words, topics that were largely ignored by their colleagues back east, but topics they considered integral to understanding the history of the U.S. when you viewed from California or Santa Fe, or even Texas. And so it seemed to several of H.H. Bolton's first doctoral students at the University of California at Berkeley. One was Charles Chapman. He's there. I don't have his picture. Who focused on the early history of California. Another was John Coe, whose dissertation led to his book, Bernardo de Galvez in Louisiana, 1776 to 1783, published in 1934. Based on extensive research in Seville's Archive of the Indies, it represented the first, it offered the first detailed account of Galvez's governorship to appear in any language, Spanish included. But it was far from comprehensive, owing to its emphasis on military matters at the expense of other aspects of Galvez's administration. Even then, Cowie failed to acknowledge the importance of a brace of important articles by a little-known historian of Florida, Catherine Trimmer Abbey, who I just discovered. She was a librarian at the University at Florida State. Her articles offered a broader strategic context for understanding how Galvez managed to orchestrate the siege of Pensacola and come out on top. Very little about Abbey is known, but she wrote these articles using materials that she found largely in Chicago's Newberry Library, archival materials that Edward Eyre had copied for him in the Archive of the Indies and other Spanish archives and brought to Chicago starting around 1916, and then deposited in the Newberry, and they're still there. Well, together, Abbey and Cowie opened the door to other studies relating to Spanish Louisiana. These studies are too numerous to mention here, but in 1951, another of Bolton's doctoral students at Berkeley, a guy called, come on, this is the hardest, Daniel Worcester, drew new attention to the Battle of Pensacola with his translation of Francisco de Miranda's diary, another diary which offered yet another eyewitness account of the siege of Pensacola. And that diary, together with the one by Galvez, captured the attention of a number of military historians dedicated to offering readers detailed accounts of the siege of Pensacola, notably this book, published by Nixon or Rush in 1966. But none of these studies attracted much attention. There was kind of specialized monographs or articles, and they did very little to change the standard account, let alone draw any popular attention to the full extent of Spain's contributions to the Revolutionary War. And I think the same can be said of this guy's, Howard Peckman's The War of Independence, a military history. It was pioneering to the extent that it devoted an entire chapter to the campaign in the South. But it was kind of curiously old-fashioned kind of book. It was not, it came to come up with some kind of old anti-Spanish prejudices, as the author's description of Galvez as someone, and I quote, someone who moved with energy unusual for a Spaniard, end of quote. Look at Begonia. Most energetic person I know. What a statement. He didn't know a Spaniard. But whatever the reason, that book did little to persuade Cleo to open her eyes, let alone alter the standard account of the war. And that also applies. Well, come on, go back to this, to Buchanan Parker Thompson's little-known, and I'm afraid best forgotten book, Spain, Forgotten Ally of the American Revolution. The reviews, one review read, "Everything is wrong about this book, from the title to the lack of an index." A little unfair, because she did go into the archives, and there, she liked Spain a lot. There she is with her Spanish mantilla in Seville. In other words, as this country celebrated its 200th anniversary, standard accounts of the war still fell short when it came to Spain. Nor had they incorporated the findings of various Spanish scholars who had studied the war. Already in 1912, for example, Marano Serrano Sanz published previous unknown materials relating to the history of both Florida and Louisiana. Next came Manuel Conrote's The Intervention of Spain and the Independence of the United States of the North, a work that was quickly superseded by Juan Francisco Yale Utria's Spain before the war, Spain together with the independence of the United States that appeared in 1925. And, come on, go back. And there things remained basically until around 1944, when a Madrid archivist by the name of Miguel Gómez de Campillo published an important edition of diplomatic correspondence relating to the war, similar to some of the material that Thomas Chavez was citing this morning. And then in 1952, Francisco Morales Padrón, from his base in Seville, published his participation, I'm translating, Participation of Spain in the Political Independence of the United States. But the real breakthrough occurred in 1976 when Spain's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in honor of the 200th anniversary of the United States, took the decision to sponsor publication of a massive compendium of documents relating to the revolution that culled from the nation's archives. And that project resulted in a sprawling 11-volume, the 11-volume compendium, the one on the right, Independence of North America, an 11-volume compendium that served as a springboard for the monographs on the war published in recent years, notably those on Spanish involvement in the war. And here's some of them. Books by Thomas Chavez, Gabriel Paquet, Larry Ferrero, Gonzalo Quinteros, and others by Jane Landers, Catherine Duval, we'll hear from later. In other words, there's a whole bevy of these things. That the starting point was that compendium. Yet for all their hard work, for all the hard work of these scholars in helping to change our view of the war, to offer a new, broader understanding of the war and the importance of Spain's contribution to that war, the standard accounts, the standard histories of the conflict remained seemingly impervious to change. As I admit, a recent, I did a little kind of a admittedly quick but unscientific look at some of the nation's most popular textbooks that are used today. And you look in those books, and they still fail to mention Galvez, let alone Spain. This is it's now, despite 30 years of work in it. Yet I remain hopeful. I'm an optimist, despite my advancing age. I believe that Cleo's eyes will soon be opened. I think this conference will help in this respect. Maybe she'll give her a boost. Something's going to happen next month with this, the airing of Ken Burns' documentary on the war. One section of, I don't know what's in it, but one section of the war is, in my understanding, is devoted to the campaign in the South. So let's see what's happened. Thanks to this conference, and hopefully Mr. Burns will have a new, broader understanding of the war and Spain's contribution to it. Vamos a ver lo que pasa, and thank you very much. And there's Cleo.
We'll take a few questions.
Sure.
You'll sit over there. Richard, your mic, Richard.
I have to answer questions?
So if anybody had any doubts about the importance of the work of historians, I think Professor Richard Kagan answered that, didn't he?
Thank you.
I have a few quick questions from the audience, Professor.
Okay.
One of them, US narratives often contrasted Spanish colonization with English colonization. How did American writers and historians perceive Spanish practices of intermarriage and incorporation of indigenous people into colonial society compared to Anglo-American practices of segregation and removal?
Well, there's two competing, that's a good complicated question. There's two visions of it. One's called the Black Legend, the other called the White Legend. The Black Legend dates from the 16th century, and a man named Bartolome de las Casas, who depicted he wrote a book, polemical treatise called Brief History of the Destruction of the Indies, in which he recounted Spanish atrocities against natives. And he did so, in other words, with great hyperbole. And he did so kind of comparing what's happening in the Americas to what happened under the Rome, to the slaughter of the innocents in the Holy Land. He exaggerated the atrocities and the deaths which took place in order to get the attention of King Philip II and get him to institute some reforms. And that vision of Lacasian vision of the destructiveness of the Spaniards in the Americas was then used by the British and the Dutch for propaganda purposes, and it was picked up by the Americans, Protestant Americans, in the 18th century, and it was revivified. It was republished in Philadelphia in English translation in 1821 at the time of the battles of Spain trying to defeat the revolutionary movements in Latin America, and at the time of the Spanish-American War in 1898, a new edition of Las Casas was issued as part of the Hearst, as part of the Yellow Press campaign to get the Americans to fight Spain and intervene in the Cuban Civil War at that particular time. That's the Black Legend, and the name was given to it by a Spanish scholar in 1914. The White Legend, however, is the antithesis. They were the best. No one treated the Native Americans more kindly and more gently than the Americans. And the people, the United States scholars most responsible for the diffusion of that image was Helen Hunt Jackson, who was a New Englander. She wrote a book called Ramona, which was after Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was the best-selling book in the 19th century America, and that was followed up by a man named Charles Loomis, who wrote a book called The Spanish Pioneers in 1890, and another bestseller, many editions, and he said that the Native Americans had never had a better friend than the Spaniards. Now, there's two poles, the truth somewhere in between. So in a sense, there was the two visions of it. For Loomis, the Spaniards much better to the Native Americans than the English, let alone the French. You have to understand those are polemical positions. You have to take a more middling one, which is I do. Hope that answers the question.
Do we have any information on the colonies' perceptions of Spanish culture during the 18th century? Are there any documents that can reflect what they knew in the colonies?
That connected the colonies to
Spain?
Well, the view, I guess, there's Jedediah, my favorite is Jedediah Morse's Geography Made Easy, which was the best-selling textbook and geographical school book and geographical book published in the 1880s and 1780s and 1790s. Spaniards, along with Portuguese, were lazy and provident people, guilty of every vice. Doesn't that say enough? Morse had very little to say about reforms in Spain. Spain never contributed anything to Western civilization, kind of an echoing of French Enlightenment view of the country that was published in not the famous encyclopedia of Diderot, but another encyclopedia. It was named the Encyclopédie Méthodique, And then that said, oh, Spanish, other than Don Quixote, the Spaniards have done nothing for the history of Western civilization. A slight exaggeration.
Another person would like to know, how can historians prevent projecting their own values and their own political thoughts, social thoughts on the work they do and they publish?
Whoa. Well, that's I just wrote this book about this guy called Henry Charles Lee. He thought he was being an objective scientific historian who, oh, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. But he, before he even read the facts that he had copied from him for the various archives, he was writing books about the Inquisition, he had decided it was the worst institution that ever existed. So he just kind of organized his facts in a way that lined up more or less with his vision of what was going to, what he wanted. He knew what the conclusion was. It's like Dan Brown's novels. He knows where he's going. He just writes them. Lee wrote in a similar way. But at the same time, and he wanted to moralize. He wanted to write objective history, but he wanted to show the reason he was interested in the Inquisition. He said that was a bad institution, did bad things in his views, and he's right. He wanted to document it, and he did so relatively. The facts he produced were accurate. He did so as a warning for the future. He didn't want any further persecutions of that nature ever to take place again. So he was doing what we would call today presentism. He was imposing his own values on the past rather than judging the past as past. And that balance, think about trying to moralize in our own ways or imposing our own present values on the past as opposed to representing the past as it was understood then, is a struggle that every historian, all of historians, I think, have to confront in all of their work. At one point, Henry Charles Lee, who was appointed the president of the American Historical Association, said, you shouldn't judge the past, in the legal terms, shouldn't judge past actors by a legal code they don't know. We can't impose our values of the 21st century upon actors in the 15th century, the 16th century, let alone the 18th century. Originalism, you have to really, if you want to go be originalist, you got to really know the epic. And sometimes I fear that some legal scholars who think they're originalists don't know enough about the epic they're plucking their low codes and court cases out of. But that's another issue.
Well, Professor, thank you so much. Two quick questions before we close. One of them is, what connection, if any, did the fall of the Franco regime and the move to Spanish democracy have in the increase of research on Spain's role in the revolution? Any connection?
Well, it didn't help. Well, because American scholars didn't go there for the most part.
No, I mean after the move of.
Oh,
afterwards.
Well, I mean, after 1705, after the Spanish transition to democracy, 75, 76, I mean, the country opened up. As I personally experienced that, the archives were much more accessible in the past. At the same time, Spain, as I mentioned, in 1976, wanted to open up its collections to Americans and to other scholars from other countries as well. And that was really the impetus behind the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that 11-volume compendium on the independence of America. And I know all of my colleagues here have used that at one moment or another. In a sense, it was a signal moment in kind of opening the Spanish archives to the world, and at the same time, foreign scholars coming to Spain, learning more about the country, and what its archives could revealed about the history of France, the United States, or wherever.
And the last question, I guess, it's a yes or no. Without Spain's help, could the Americans really have achieved independence?
I'll leave it to the experts.
I'll leave it to the experts. Thank you very much. Allow me. Thank you, Professor.
Okay. Thank you. Is that all right?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's do this, and I'm just going to say.
Huh?
Your Majesty, as you depart from Spain, the board and the executive team of the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute and all of us present here today would like to reiterate our deep appreciation for your presence at this second Symposium, America and Spain 250. Your steadfast support for the America and Spain 250 initiative through the Fundación Reina Sofía has given it greater visibility and significance. Your work on behalf of the humanities, music, history, art, the environment, and neurodegenerative research, to name a few of the causes you're involved with, continues to be a true inspiration. Muchísimas gracias, señora, por desplazaros hasta Washington y por vuestro cariño al Instituto. Os deseamos un muy buen viaje de regreso. Please join me in bidding farewell to Her Majesty Queen Sofia. We will reconvene here at 3 p.m. Thank you.